Um, hello, everybody, and welcome to the rise of non-alcoholic spirits, how they're made and how to use them. Today, essentially, we're going to talk about this new and burgeoning category of non-alcoholic spirits, and we're going to even talk a little bit about how that word spirits is a little awkward in there. I have an expert panel, a wonderful panel today, starting with Lauren Paylor. So Lauren Paylor is the owner of FOH, which is Focus on Health, which is an organization that deals with industry, hospitality industry, health concerns. And she's also the R&D chef at Silver Lion in Washington, D.C. Hello, Lauren.
Hi, everyone.
And then we have Monique Kortenaar, who is the head distiller from Lucas Bowls, and she is the creator of Damrock Virgin 0.0. Hello, Monique.
Hi, all.
And we are lucky to have John deBary, who is a creator of Proto and the author of Drink What You Want. Hello, John.
What's happening?
And last but certainly not least is Laura Lashley, who is the National Education Manager for Seedlip. Hi, Laura, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks.
Good. So this is a great panel, and I want to jump right into it. This is certainly a unique tales for all of us, even though I believe all of us have been before. But I think that we can definitely share a lot of excellent information. So regardless of this sort of unique online virtual format, I'm psyched to be here. My name is Derek Brown, and I am the author of Spirit, Sugar, Water, Bitters, How a Cocktail Conquered the World, and a forthcoming book called Mindful Mixology, a comprehensive guide to no and low alcohol cocktails. So I almost forgot my own book. And I am the director of brand education for Spiritless, which created Kentucky 74, which is a non-alcoholic bourbon alternative analog. We'll get into that. And I'm the owner of the Columbia Room in Washington, D.C. So just to begin with, I want to give people a context of why we are talking about this at all. It's principally because this is such a growing segment of spirits. It's still very small in terms of overall numbers, but its growth has been just absolutely a rocket. If anybody follows Camper English, they know he's an expert on ice, but we're not talking about ice today. We're going to talk about his list of non-alcoholic spirits. He's been keeping track of them, and I've been keeping track of them. So I remember at one point there was like 30, then 50, then 60, then 80, and now there's 118 non-alcoholic spirits. I think 71 of which are in the United States. That's going to change by the time this seminar comes out because we're pre-recording it. So it's already growing between now and then. But that's not a lot. Think about how many vodkas there are. There's like 118 on some people's shelves. So, but it's gone from like 2 to 118 in like a matter of 3 years. So it's incredible. According to the IWSR market analysis, US sales have grown 289% CAGR between 2016 and 2020. That's 78.9% last year alone, and they expect double-digit growth in the next 5 years. But you see it everywhere, right? Like we see it all over the place. There's non-alcoholic bars, there's non-alcoholic cocktails, there's non-alcoholic cocktail books. There's all of this growing interest in no and low, especially no alcohol spirits. So, we want to get to that. We want to dive right in, but I want to set it up a little bit that this is a new category and it's like no category before. Like I said, it's a little bit of a misnomer that it's called spirits because according to government TTB definition, a spirit has alcohol in it. And these do not. Some of them do, though. Some have 0.5%. That's the legal amount in the United States to call it non-alcoholic, 0.5% or less. But really that's as much as a ripe banana in some cases. So it's not a lot. So it doesn't technically have spirits in it, the spirits, at least according to the definition. But I guess the way we're talking about it, we can debate this, is we're talking about like oat milk or veggie burgers, right? Like we know that oat milk is not from a cow, right? If you don't know, I'm sorry that today's the day you learn that, but it's true. And so we're talking about something that is like a spirit, and they're often used in the same way. And the whole category is super unique, but the only one I can think that it's like analogous to is rum, right? Rum is anarchy. I mean, there are really wonderful, clearly defined rules within certain areas for rum, but not across the world. It's made from sugar in 20,000 different ways. There's like aged and dark and flavored, and you know, this many years, that many years. It's just all over the place, right? Rum is anarchy. So maybe it's closest to that, but at least with rum, you have a common denominator with sugar, right? Sugar spirit. With non-alcoholic spirits, I guess the common denominator is water. So we'll get into that. But spirits have water too, though, just to be clear, and lots of it. So what are they? What are they made from? And we're just going to start with two broad categories, right? There are ones that are analogous or analog to existing spirits, right? So like Kentucky 74, that is a bourbon alt or a bourbon analog. It's meant to replace bourbon when you can't drink bourbon, right? But you also have some kind of outliers, you know, ones that are made from maple syrup and maple syrup vinegar and coffee. What is that? I don't know. It doesn't have an existing category. But that, you know, so I'm just going to refer to those as non-conforming. So those are the two broadest categories. And then under that, we have distilled, that they actually are distilled, and compounded, that are put together, right? Like you mix a drink in a way, but more complicated. We'll get into that too. So that's enough for me. Hopefully that gives you an introduction to the category. I want to turn to Monique, who is that's not a backdrop, she's actually in her distillery right now, and ask her, what is a distilled non-alcoholic spirit?
Yes, like you said, so the whole spirit, well, non-alcoholic product, is actually distilled like the one in one of the stills, like for instance, the one behind me. In our case, no, actually, like we make it with hydro distillates, so actually cold, so it's water distillates. So what you're doing is distill the botanicals not in a mixture of alcohol and water in this case, but it's just water, which makes it more difficult actually to get the right flavors in, give some extra.
The hydro distillates essentially create, you know, the infusion in a sense that alcohol would, but they're harder, right? Like
yeah, harder. I was looking like it gives more like problems, or like more, how do you say it, like difficulties to yeah. So the problem with water distillates is it gives more difficulties to get the right flavor in your spirit sometimes. So you need to find other ways to create those, to get those from the botanicals, which normally you just do by distilling with water and alcohol, and you can even soak them. But yeah, in some cases you cannot in water distillates.
So can you give us more specifics about some of those problems that come up during it? Like I think you and I have had a conversation before. There's like literally there's rot involved in it in some cases if it's not done well, right?
Yeah, definitely. Especially if you look at the citrus peels. They get like really soaked and mushy, and you cannot leave them for a long time in water anyway, because then they will rotten. So what we do with the water distillates is actually put a kind of, I said like plates in the top of the still, and put the lemon peels or the orange peels on top of those. So only the steam will go through the plates, the sieves, as you can also call it. So you won't get the completely soaked citrus peels, but you can still get a lot of flavor out. But still, it's more difficult than with alcohol, of course, because you have the oils of the peels that you want to get out, and they're not really soluble in water.
Yeah, and I think that for a lot of people, the perception is, oh, this doesn't have alcohol, so it's easier and cheaper, but it doesn't sound like that's true.
No, it's not.
And I don't think that's, and I don't think that's true for compounded products either. I want to turn to John, because compounding is a totally different thing. I mean, essentially you're creating, you're putting together various things, and in some cases that includes, vinegar, and in some cases that includes different oils. And John, take it away. I'm gonna spoil it. You're gonna tell us what compounded spirits are made of.
Yeah, so for me, like as the creator of Proto, like I settled on compounding not because of some predetermined idea, but just because I was creating something in my kitchen the way that I would any cocktail. So to make it really simple, a compounded spirit or a compounded drink is simply a cocktail, honestly. I created extractions into water, I blended them with vinegar, with clarified fruit, and built it in the same way as I would any cocktail, trying to hit these different points of balance in terms of acidity and bitterness and body and sweetness and persistence on the palate. And for that reason, it's hard for me to call Proto itself a spirit, because it doesn't really seek to behave that way, both in terms of the way that it tastes on its own and as a potential for being mixed. So it is, like you said, it is a lot like the rum category, where it's hard to say like this is the one kind of rum that exemplifies everything else. It's a really like wiry category that I think, just by nature of the fact that it's an alternative to something else, and also just the novelty of the category itself, is still these kind of distinctions are being mapped out, and will probably continue to evolve, which is probably maddening for some people, but I think it's just a matter of maturity before these things get really ironed out in a way that's useful for someone who isn't fully steeped in cocktail and spirits culture. So for me, I just approached it like a cocktail, and for me, as a bartender, serving someone an unfinished drink was kind of unthinkable to me. So I wanted Proto to be like, it's done. Like, I did all the work for you. And I think that's probably what defines a lot of these compounded and outlier things. You mentioned the maple syrup and coffee, which I'm assuming was in a reference to Sacre, and I think I feel a kinship with them too, because they're also not going after something that people have had before. And I think that's a huge challenge for people like us, because you're kind of working against a lot of like mysteriousness. Like, you're already kind of have these layers of like, oh, it's non-alcoholic, but it's also not anything you ever had before. And so I think that's also what makes the category so exciting, is because you're really not beholden to a lot of, in many cases, centuries of baggage in terms of like gin or whiskey.
Yeah, and obviously some people just recoil at the idea of like an alternative to gin. It's like, no, a gin can only be this thing, and it kind of makes sense, but it's complicated. So I'm going to turn that over to you, Lauren. You seem to do well in complications. So as the R&D chef, so how do you navigate this like complex field right now?
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting because working with cocktails that contained spirits in them for so long, transitioning to the non-alcoholic space definitely was different. Having worked with Seedlip for a period of time certainly assisted on that journey of understanding how to, incorporate it in cocktails. But the best advice I have when mixing drinks is really focusing on flavor, but understanding that this is an alternative, right? So if we're attempting to mimic a classic cocktail, for instance, we need to take into consideration the mouthfeel and the density, right? We're really focusing on flavor and how what we're incorporating complements what we're using when making these beverages. So if we're using John's product, or I'm using Seedlip, for instance, I'm going to approach the cocktail making process very differently. You know, perhaps my flavors won't be as concentrated when I'm working with one product versus actually incorporating more concentrated flavors or ingredients with another product. Maybe I'm not shaking as rigorously because it doesn't have as much density, but I'm incorporating ingredients such as egg white or aquafaba, maybe even soda that has that very crisp, effervescent quality. Depending on the base that I'm incorporating, if there's no sugar, I'm going to need to add that to make sure that my drink is balanced. Ultimately, we want to make sure whatever we're passing over the bar is delicious, right? Additionally, that we're really providing education and understanding with what we are, giving the guests. One of the things that's proven to work in my favor when talking about non-alcoholic beverages with guests, because they don't really understand, and it really is our job to place ourselves in a position where we are guiding them. One, gauge how interested they are in having this conversation. Am I going to spend 5 minutes talking to this person about this and they don't really, they're not really interested, or am I going to give them what they need to know? So gauge, where you are in that conversation too. I want to set them up for success. If their goal is to go home and mimic what I'm doing, provide them with information that will help them, right? So for instance, if they're working with Seedlip, I'd probably start them off with, hey, if you're going to use Seedlip, there's 3 different expressions. They're all delicious. Depending on what direction you want to go in, start with ginger ale, then slowly add citrus and a little bit of sugar. Now let's start, getting fun, play with different types of ice, play with incorporating different types of syrups, different types of juices, different types of sodas. Slowly plug things in and out, but understand we always want to make sure that mouthfeel is ideal. It's delicious, it's full-bodied, it's crisp, when we're adding that soda water, that everything we're adding is with intention and it has a purpose.
That's a really good point, because the textural aspect of it is a huge part of it. I was at Jack Rose the other day, which is a great cocktail bar and whiskey bar in DC. And I was with the owner, Bill Thomas, who's a whiskey collector, and tasting him on Kentucky 74, which is the bourbon alt. And, I just happened to say, oh, why don't you all make a brown derby with the spiritless? But I forgot to say, but be careful about the texture, because it does make a very good brown derby, right? It does fill in some ways for the bourbon. There's similar flavors in the vanilla and char and etc. But texturally, it's not the same. And in terms of piquancy, like this is a term that I use that bite, the thing that twists your face when you have a tequila or whiskey or what have you, and slam your hand down on the table. That is not going to be there in a non-alcoholic spirit, not always, or sometimes it's put in there, and I'm not going to name names, some of them in a very awkward way, right? Like some of it just tastes like somebody added a shot of hot sauce to your quote unquote spirit. So how do you, Laura, let me just go back to you. How do you deal with like that idea of piquancy?
Yeah, it's interesting. So one thing I think is important to state when you're working with non-alcoholic bases, do not get that notion or that thought in your mind that they are directly replicating spirits, because that's certainly not the case by any means. And it's you have to kind of unlearn in that regard. So my best advice when, working with that particular like component in beverages, make sure we're tasting these things before we put them in the drink like anything else. Additionally, I know that when we're going into these situations, having a good understanding of classic cocktails does work in our favor with beverages that contain alcohol. With beverages that don't, it's really important that we understand what we are working with in that base, that we understand textually what we're working with. If there's like a little acidity, that we understand that we don't need to necessarily add as much acid in our drink. We can compensate with another flavor, right? Maybe I'm not putting as much lemon juice, but instead I'm putting some orange juice. And so it's just a matter of, again, kind of going back to what I was saying before, taking a few steps back and, or maybe adding a few more of something else. So if I was making a brown derby with spiritless, I probably would cut back the amount of grapefruit juice and honey that I was incorporating in it. And, you know, I might even top it off with soda. And again, it just depends. And making sure when we're having that conversation with our guests, it's like, this might be a little different than you're accustomed to, but it will be recognizable.
And you know, that's awesome that you have kind of like contextualized this well, but I don't know if everybody has. Again, sometimes people just grab it and they're like, cool, I'm going to put this in place of that. And Laura, I know that you have spent a lot of time educating bartenders about this, as Seedlip is obviously one of the forerunners of the non-alcoholic experience. What has been your experience when you're encountering bartenders throughout the country, and how are they using it?
Yeah, I think I want to double down kind of on what Lauren said about flavor first. I think that is like the most important thing, regardless of what, you know, whether you're working with something that's an analog or something like Seedlip that, you know, has its own kind of flavor profile and its own space. You know, we all need a place to start and we all need something to hang on to. So I do generally say, like what you said about the brown derby, I'll say, hey, you know, try an east side, but use garden instead, or something along those lines. And my experience has been that it's, you know, you do have to compensate. There is an expectation that comes along with all of us with our baggage of like, hey, I've been a bartender for a really long time. I know how to work with spirits. I know what the ratios should be. I know what kind of splits I like in my sweet and sour. And that's like the biggest, it sounds really elementary, but that is like the number one problem that I encounter with people mixing Seedlip, putting not enough sugar and too much acid, because we don't really think about how much sugar is in an actual traditional alcoholic spirit. So when you remove that from the equation, the template is just off. And so that's kind of the first thing I call out when people are playing around with classics. And then, you know, once you have a handle, like Lauren was saying, on like, wow, what does this actually taste like? How can I make these flavors shine through? I'm not trying to equivocate maybe like, you know, exactly the flavor that I would get out of a gin or a rum, but it has all these complementary flavors that work well in these cocktails. And that's kind of where I approach it with Seedlip, is that, you know, and if somebody says, hey, what's the best non-alc vodka? The first thing I ask is, well, how do you like to drink your vodka? Because if they like to drink a Cosmo, I can recommend one kind of product. If they like a vodka tonic, I recommend a different kind of product. It's not necessarily so much about, at least with Seedlip, and I think a few other products on the market, it's not so much about exactly replacing flavors as it is considering the whole picture. And I think it's interesting that John said, you know, he approaches proto like a cocktail. And I think, you know, that's such a good way to think about non-alc in general, whether it's the original product that you're starting with or the end cocktail that you're trying to get to, is like, it should taste complete. And that, you know, that piquancy and texture that you were referring to is not necessarily about, I need to put you know, I need to put hot sauce in there. I need burn to replicate burn. But you do want something that's going to create complexity for your palate, and it's going to slow you down while you're drinking, and it's going to taste like an adult beverage and not just a bunch of juice in a glass.
Fair. And you know, it's there. You have the ones that you know, like proto, that have that complexity to start with. I definitely would drink that just like I would drink a wine sometimes, just chill it and pour it in a glass. But you know, with the more analog products, and Monique, we're going to turn to you for a second and talk about Damrak Virgin. Like, it's not just like, I mean, it is an analog. It is meant to be there. And to be honest with you, tasting it next to regular Damrak, amazing. You did amazing work, but it's not the same, is it?
No, it's not. Well, yeah, that's also like understandable, because you miss an important part of your original product. And it's not just the alcohol you miss, it's the whole experience and the whole flavor boost and perception it gives. So you cannot really, well, you can use it as a replacement, but don't expect it to be exactly the same, because at this point that's not possible yet. And yeah, and
I think that's, you know, it's important to put a pin here, because I think there is a certain type of person who challenges the very idea of a non-alcoholic spirit, right? They're probably the same person who pushes shots on you when you go to a bar. Here, have a shot, have a shot. I don't want a shot. I just want to enjoy myself and not get hammered. There is this idea that, like, you know, it's not a replacement. And maybe it's not desirable in the first place to be a replacement. You know, maybe you do want it to take on other dimensions, but not all of them you're going to drink on its own. So Laura, what do you think about that? Like, some of these are to drink on their own. You know, John's a good example, but Seedlip, I mean, frankly, I would not drink that on its own. No offense to Seedlip.
No, please don't. Whatever you do, please don't. No, I think it's a really good point, because, you know, when you're tasting bartenders or people who come from a spirits background, or even consumers, the instinct is, well, let me try this product by itself, and that's how I'm going to evaluate it, because that's how we've been taught to evaluate really good alcoholic spirits. And so if you say, oh, no, I'm going to mix it first, or I want to put something in it, people are like, well, you're trying to trick me. Like, how will I know what it really tastes like? And I think that, you know, with Seedlip and other, you know, products with no sugar, it's really important to have that mixed experience, because the flavor carriers that exist in alcohol and sugar aren't there in the product by itself. And that's intentional, at least in the case of Seedlip. When Ben made Seedlip, he had the experience of tasting so many super over the top, sort of sickly sweet non-alcoholic products that were really geared towards like the palate of kids. And so he wanted to put that control of sugar in the hands of the bartender, in the hands of the consumer at home. And so in order to kind of awaken the flavors and uncover all of these botanicals in Seedlip, you do need to add some mixer and bring it to life. And that, you know, that increases the textural element as well. It also, you know, kind of carries those flavors to the front of your palate and makes them pop. And that, you know, I would always recommend, if you're actually almost reversing the process. So what I'll usually do is present a cocktail to someone first, have them try it, and then walk it back and have them try the product neat after, so that they can see the flavors that is contributing to the final drink. And I think that's like how we have to switch our minds, stop trying to think of these products as what they don't have and compensating for it in drinks, and actually just really understand what flavors they are contributing, and then thinking about your drink holistically that way.
Yeah, because this is not necessarily like to replace alcohol. I mean, some of them are alternatives, but, you know, if you can drink alcohol and you enjoy alcohol, why would, you know, of course, you know, that makes perfect sense. But for some of us, you know, we don't drink, or some people have problems with drinking. Some people just don't want to drink. Some people have religious considerations. Some people are running a marathon tomorrow. And as we know, alcohol does affect our performance. And so I think that, like, you know, these are not meant to like supplant the whole category of alcohol. This is not temperance 2.0. You know what I mean? This is an opportunity to have a plethora of choices. And in that way, it's awesome. But I want to turn back to you, John, and talk about that idea of like drinking them on their own, like, because you come from a different perspective.
Yeah, I think it was like what Laura said about kind of, you can't define things by what they're not and sort of compensate that way. I think it's really exciting to be able to have the liberation from a lot of baggage to be able to like explore flavors and sensations that aren't kind of relative to another, which is something that I think that's important for me when I was developing Kortenaar. Was like, I don't want to remind someone of what they're choosing or are unable to have. And I think by having Kortenaar be a it's mixable. It's definitely, it's good with a lot of things. It's good with alcohol, honestly. So it does play well with others, but really the main purpose is for it to just provide an experience right out of the bottle, and also provide an experience that's unlike anything else. And I think that when you are navigating a category that is so nebulous and sort of unexplored, it makes it really fun for people to be able just crack something open and just have that experience and not feel like they have to do something right or wrong to get what So for me, I think a lot of the really fun spirits and other non-alcoholic drinks that are coming out that are ready to drink, whether they're kind of canned, sort of gussied up sodas or or things like saccharin or whatever, are kind of offering a more kind of mind-altering experience, if you will, from a kind of a cognitive culinary standpoint, rather than perhaps reminding someone of what they're missing. So it's really not to be an affirmative experience, just like, I want to drink this because this is my choice, and because it's there.
And I was reminded of something, for those who haven't explored Julia Bainbridge's book, Good Drinks, and her corresponding Substack letter, whatever. I actually forget the medium it's on, but she has a newsletter as well that I get. Yeah, Substack. Cool. Okay, good. So Julia Bainbridge's Good Drinks Substack. She was doing an interview with Bruce Blossel, and Bruce Blossel does Delmosa Beverages, which makes this incredible array of non-alcoholic wines that, like, defy the concept of wine, and some of them, were made with like sea buckthorn and don't even, you can call them wine. They're in a wine bottle, but they're not. And Bruce, and her were in this back and forth interview. We're talking about the fact that some people have never even drank alcohol. Some people, it's not a point of reference. And as bartenders, we make an assumption that every single person that comes in the bar is familiar with, what they're drinking, right? So they know what bourbon tastes like, they know what tequila tastes like, and these are discrete categories for them. But for some people, it's not even there. They don't even have that sort of state of reference, which I think is a really interesting point. Most of us do. Most of us do understand that these categories exist, and that's our base of reference. But for some, we don't. So I think a lot of good points in there. And I think that, like, we also have to understand that, like, there's base spirits and there's cordials and mixers, and these things kind of float around in all of those, right? Like, I remember, John, before I talked to you about Proto and really got kind of like, your perspective on it, I was like, okay, how am I gonna use this? Like, I was like, is it a vermouth? Kind of, right? Like, is it a Maro? I think that's something that you comment on as well. I was like, kind of, like, is it a kombucha? Kind of, like, it just has a lot of these different characteristics. So it could be used in a lot of different ways, or just drank on its own, which is pretty cool. But this is a young category, right? So a lot of these spirits are the monkeys shot into space. They are the first ones to go. And this category was really born in the last decade for sure. So there's a lot of potential. So Monique, I wanted to talk to you about where you see, especially in the kind of technology, from a distiller's point of view, like, what is the potential for this category to grow?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of potential. The thing is, it's like an unfamiliar point. Like, of course, a lot of people already make non-alcoholic drinks, like sodas and those kind of things. But to make a product that in a way replaces or like gives some other, how do you say, like, idea of the drink, there's still a lot to figure out and to do and to look into different processes. So yeah, I definitely think there's still some room to improve, and yeah.
How long did it take you to come up with Damrak Virgin 0.0?
Took between 2 and 2.5 years to finalize this recipe, because we did like different types of distillation and filtration, and tried to see what was the best way to extract the flavors that we wanted to have in our products. So there's, like I said, there's still room for improvement, because there will probably be some processes that we didn't even try or will come up in the next few years or so. Yeah, it can take a while, but yeah.
Yeah, I encourage people to think about it a lot like, London Dry Gin in some ways, in the you know, in the mid 19th century, this category was born out of, you know, previous categories of gin, but there was a new distillation technology. It was brand new. And obviously now it's like a wonderful, there's so many wonderful London dry gins, but you know, it did take time for them to get as excellent as they are today. And that is, you know, a significant period of time. And this category itself is so young. I mean, and Laura, like, if you could tell me a little, I mean, like Seedlip took a while to develop, and how did that process go?
Yeah, I think just back to what you were saying a second ago, I think, you know, it took us a lot of like frozen meatless patties in the 90s to get to Beyond Beef. And so there's obviously like innovative technology around sort of spaces like this happening in oat milk and all of these things that you're mentioning as kind of are analogies that I like to think about too. Not to say again that we're all striving to be exact replacements, but this is a slightly different, you know, a different thing. But with Seedlip, I think, you know, the process, Monique really nailed it. It's like there's this assumption like it's really quick and easy to make something like this. And, you know, when Ben started out trying to formulate and come up with Seedlip, it took him a couple of years as well. And he talked to a lot of people who were like, we have no idea how to make that. We're not interested in trying. We, you know, that seems crazy. And so getting down to the shelf stable liquid that, you know, that you could sell and work with took a really long time and was a very thoughtful process. And so I like, you know, the word spirit, even though it might be a bit of a misnomer, because it really, it gives it a little bit of weight. It's like, hey, this is not just like something you can make in 4 minutes and, you know, throw in a drink. This is something that takes care and thought. And it also, you know, educates people. This, like you were saying, it's the base, at least in the case of Seedlip and other sort of products that are meant to replicate a base spirit structure. You know, I get asked all the time, oh, is this like a modifier or a mixer, or what do I do with this? So I think that the word spirit kind of gives it that weight and that importance, but it also teaches people how to mix with it.
Yeah, no doubt. Lauren, I have a question for you about this, since you have multiple perspectives that you look at this, but one of them is as the R&D chef. What would you like to see out there? Now, obviously there's 118 products, 71 of which are in the United States, but it's still a small drop in the sea. What would you like to see be created out there?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because we're currently experiencing history, and I think we can say that basically about anything. But what's, you know, I think for me, what's cool about this is that we did not have non-alcoholic spirits a couple of years ago, right? And I urge bartenders and folks who are the ones making drinks to be vocal and open about what it is that they want to work with behind their bars. You know, I think it's important that we're working collectively to ensure that this category is truly amazing. And it's a really fun position and place to be in. I personally do not imbibe. I think I drink like twice a month. And having those options for me is super important. You know, I used to not have any spirits in my home at all. And now it's full of all these non-alcoholic options, which is really amazing and beautiful. And I think it really is important additionally to ensure that we're continuing to unlearn the way that we think about approaching this category, specifically because we do have major influence in regards to the consumer, right? Think about how many times you've made a drink for someone and they're like, oh man, I can't wait to go home and make this, or man, thank you so much for taking the time to explain that to me. We have great power in that sense and in that perspective, and I just think it's really important with anything else that we do that these non-alcoholic or boozeless options that we offer are not an afterthought, that they're not placed at the back of the menu with the kids drinks, that they're not, you know, oh snap, we're opening next week and we haven't thought about the non-alcoholic cocktails, that we're taking the same time and care, because these are products, as Laura said, that take time. You know, they're, you know, Monique and John and Laura are not just doing this because it's easy. It takes time and care, and we should, you know, we should honor that and display and show the respect that these products deserve, and be proud to serve them in our establishments.
I think that's a great way to sum it all up. Now, there is an interesting thing here. At this point in the seminar, usually if we were at the actual in-person Tales of the Cocktail, I'd be like, what are the questions? And there would be hundreds of people out there in the audience raising their hand, anxious to learn. So we have to kind of anticipate some of the questions that are going to be asked. So I'm gonna throw the first one out there. And this is one that I think is we kind of touched upon a little bit in the beginning, but with alcohol and with sugar, you have pretty good preservatives, right? And Lauren, you mentioned that you have like cabinets full of non-alcoholic spirits, and so do I. I've tasted so many of them at this point, but they definitely don't last always the same way that regular spirits do, because they don't have alcohol and or sugar to preserve them. So I'm just going to throw this out to the panel, and anyone can answer, like, how do they keep the spirits in general? Like, I guess what I should say is, how are these spirits on in terms of shelf stability and shelf life?
Can I give an answer on that from my side?
You could start, you and then John. I see John's hand up too. Go ahead, Monique.
Okay. In our case, we made sure that the pH, so the acidity, is low enough. That's also why, for instance, it's not nice to drink as such, because you have already the acidity that you normally add, like Lauren also mentioned, I think at one point. So in this case, that also helps. You have to be like below a certain level of acidity. And yeah, preservatives. You can also like use pasteurization. We didn't do that yet, but yeah, that would be an option as well.
John.
Yeah, I think I got really lucky in that just my palate, as I think a lot of bartenders have really like high acid palates. So I just created something that I thought was delicious, and using the vinegar, the acidity was in that range where it's shelf stable, and then you do heat the bottles after you close them. So basically it's sterilized, and I've been super lucky, and we've had lab tests and everything. And the product itself is really stable, which is a huge relief that you have to change the recipe you're adding to it to be able to get it shelf stable. Once it's open, obviously there's sort of like a freshness issue, and with the carbonation on the spritz, which is one of the products, that obviously goes off. But in terms of just in the bottle on a cabinet, we're seeing a year at least, which is it was a relief to me to find out.
Nice. Well, in general, I would just also recommend that people do follow the guidelines that they're given in terms of the bottle, because each bottle might be different. John's and Monique's are different, as we just heard. So, and approach that when you're looking at your, if you are a bar manager or beverage director, when you're putting a cocktail in your menu, you might want to take a look at that and kind of understand, like, oh, is this, once I open this, what's the range and life of that? Because it might not be exactly the same as the spirit. And Lauren, you had another suggestion as well.
Yeah, for sure. I always advise buying smaller bottle sizes if you have the option to. Obviously, I know not all the brands do, but if you're not making, and I don't, again, I'm not drinking very much, even with the non-alcoholic stuff. So I just buy the smaller bottles if that's an option. Additionally, if there's a local bar that, works with non-alcoholic beverages, I usually just go up and buy their RTDs to save myself the trouble of wasting product.
You said buy, and it brings up a really good question. I know that people would ask, because when you go to buy a rum or you go to buy a gin, you know, you just go to a distributor, right? You have this 3-tiered system, and it's, you know, there's a list of them. You pick it, you call them, and they deliver it to you. But it is a little different with non-alcoholic experience. And I wonder if I could direct that to you, Laura. Like, how do you buy seedlip, for instance?
So our distribution footprint is a little bit complicated, but we do follow the 3-tier system. We're part of the Diageo family now, and we had to make a decision early on about seedlip if we were going to try to go into like grocery distributors, food distributors, or work direct to consumer exclusively. And ultimately, we wanted these products in the hands of bartenders, and we felt like the best way to do that was to sell them where they got the rest of their spirits and introduce them that way. So that's a piece of our puzzle, but that's not to say you can't get seedlip in other ways. You can buy it directly from us online, which is a huge opportunity that the non-alc space carries. That is a limitation for alcohol. So there's many ways, and it does complicate things sometimes, but ultimately it just means there's actually more access, which is great.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of access in general. So we have a few more minutes left, so I want to make sure to get in whatever last questions that exist. Actually, there's just so much that exists. So if we had another hour, I know that we could fill it. Before we dive into sort of the last questions, I wanted to just sort of make an appeal in general. I think everybody here who's attending this seminar, sorry, you're not here, I'm in my house in Washington, DC, but you're here in the virtual sense. And you've probably already committed to some level of engagement with non-alcoholic spirits. If you are a consumer, you're buying them and you're curious. If you are a beverage manager or bartender, you're like, how do I do this? So I applaud you for being here in the first place. But I do want, not just you, but the people you encounter, to encourage them to be serious minded about non-alcoholic beverages. They are not only something that's growing rapidly and something that most people consider. I mean, I think one statistic says that 50% of people who drink spirits want to cut back on their drinking. So it's not just for people who don't drink at all. We mentioned those, or people who have religious considerations, or athletes. It's some people just don't want to drink so much, and so there's a range of ways to do that. Non-alcoholic stuff. With spiritless, we encourage people sometimes to just split it in half, like take bourbon and spiritless and put those together in a cocktail. That way you can already cut it 50-50. So we call it halfsies, and you can do that with a lot of different non-alcoholic spirits. But just in general, whatever your approach to it is, to make sure that you have a program and you're thinking about it, like, because more and more people are come in your bar and ask for it. I go out, and every time I go out, it's like a struggle. Like, I don't really drink that much. So what am I going to do? Like, am I just going to sit there and nurse water? Do I have Coca-Cola? Do I have some kind of strange concoction that the bartender is putting together in the moment that has no bearing to a delicious cocktail at all, but just involves every acid that they can put in it? It's a scary world. So having a plan, a program is really important. So just in general, not necessarily the closing, we have more to talk about, but just an appeal to everybody to take seriously this program, and don't just have it, as Lauren was mentioning, at the bottom of their menu, but really consider it, because it's coming at you regardless. With the last couple minutes, I would just like to ask each panelist what they'd like to add, and if there's anything else on their mind. So we'll start with you, Laura, since you're at the top of my screen.
Yeah, actually, that's perfect, because I wanted to piggyback on what you just said. I think, I look back on my time before I worked for seedlip. I was bartender in New York. I worked there for almost 12 years in all different kinds of bars, cocktail bars, restaurant bars, dive bars. And I remember pretty vividly, kind of hopefully internally, but maybe a little externally, rolling my eyes when people would come up in the middle of a really busy shift when I was like 4 deep and ask for something non-alcoholic, because it would slow me down, and I would have to have this whole conversation with someone like, oh, do you like ginger? Or the server would come up and say, hey, I've got someone on table 10 that needs something non-alcoholic. And it was this like the wrench in the cog of our service machine. But also I realized I was a little bit embarrassed because I knew I couldn't make anything as good or as creative or as fulfilling for someone who wasn't drinking as I could for their friend who was having a bourbon cocktail. And I think that, you know, regardless of the style of product or you know, the way it's made exactly or what they're calling themselves, that is what to me as a hospitality professional is so exciting about this movement, is it really just gives you that opportunity to be creative as a bartender, which I think is something that we all love to do. But it's also a real way to provide, you know, full, sincere hospitality to every single person who comes in your door. And I think that's priceless. And that's what is so cool about all these products. And I can't wait to see where this whole category grows.
Awesome. John, any final comments?
I'm glad I'm next. I want to echo both of you. I think that it's definitely, if you're making an appeal to people who run programs and are in charge of decision making behind the bar and in restaurants, taking non-alc seriously is not only good hospitality, but usually good hospitality translates to good business. And that's been my experience as someone who ran bar programs from the Mofuku for a million years, is that when we added non-alc cocktails to our menu in a very serious way, whether they were integrated into the cocktail program in general or kind of called out in a separate, you know, not on the bottom of the menu, but, you know, somewhere else in the menu, we just saw our sales increase. Like, it didn't take away from, you know, wine sales or cocktail sales. This is just people who are like probably resigned to having water or a Coke or something kind of uninspiring. And even if you're talking about 2% of people, like, that's what hospitality is all about. That's what accessibility is all about. Like, you're thinking about that one person in 100 who needs something special, who needs something else from you that's not what everyone else is getting. And you're leaving just a huge part of your job out if you're only thinking about 98% of people. So.
Well put, definitely well put. Monique, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, the only thing, but I think Lauren already took that point earlier. I think it's really important to educate the people, bartenders, but also the public itself, that you don't need to have this alcoholic cocktail just because your friends are having it. Like, and there's, what can you do with these spirits, or, well, non-alcoholic spirits, like we call them. And that might help actually for people to choose and to make even better drinks with it as well. So I think we should be really proud of what we already achieved, but there's still a way to go, I think.
That's awesome. Lauren, what would you like to add?
Yeah, you know, I think the only thing I want to touch on is that the same way, you know, we attend seminars and sessions and, you know, get certifications to be well-rounded. This is just another component that we can add to our list of versatility. We need to be able to be, you know, accommodating. That really is, you know, basically what John said, that being a good bartender, being a good hospitality individual is all about being able to provide the best experience to every and any guest that walks into your establishment. So being prepared, being proactive, asking the questions that you don't have the answers to, so that you do have a thorough understanding, and having fun with it. It should be fun, and you should be proud of whatever it is that you ultimately hand over.
That's awesome. Well done. I don't have anything else to add to all that. I think that was a great way to sum it all up. The only thing that I would like to say is to thank everybody for joining us out there in the virtual world. And I wish that we could be in person. I can't wait till we can be in person. I also want to take an opportunity to thank Tales of the Cocktail for including this, because I think that it actually takes a little bit of bravery to put non-alcoholic stuff in there to a group of, you know, thousands of hard drinking bartenders. So kudos to that. And thank you to Lola Thomas for helping to facilitate this particular seminar, and all of them really, but ours in particular. And that's it. So we hope to continue this conversation in real life and for years to come. So thank you all very, very much.
Thanks, everyone.